Today's lesson is on conflict in literature. We will discuss the different types of conflict, and we will also discuss why conflict is important to a story. So let's start with our definition of conflict. Conflict is the struggle between opposing forces in a story. A lot of times it's easy to think of it as the good guy versus the bad guy, like we talked about with protagonist versus antagonist, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's not person versus person. There can be other struggles that a character might face. Why do we need conflict? Well, without conflict, we don't have a plot. As we saw in our plot pyramid, during our plot structure lesson, without the conflict, you do not push the story forward. It ignites the rising action. In the exposition of a story, we learn about the characters and setting, and then we're introduced to conflict, and from there we actually see some action in our story, culminating in the climax where the conflict is faced between the main characters, and then it's resolved one way or the other. There are two main types of conflict. They are external and internal. External meaning outside, internal meaning inside. And we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that means. Let's start with external conflict. External conflict is between a character and an outside force. The three main types of external conflict that we see are man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus society. Internal conflict is between a character and his or herself. So it's an inside conflict where the character is struggling maybe with a decision or something of that nature. We'll discuss in a little more detail in a few slides. Let's go back to the external conflict. Let's talk about man versus man first. This is probably the most common, well-known type of conflict where it's one man versus another man, or maybe a group of people, like we talked about in protagonist versus antagonist. And this is where a character faces a struggle against that other character. Good guy versus bad guy, right? Man versus nature is where a character is actually struggling against nature. Maybe he is stranded in the jungle, stranded on a desert island. Maybe he is fighting some type of beast. The example I give in here is the book Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. Some of you may have read that in elementary school. It's a really good book. It's about this young kid who his plane crashes and he's stranded in the forest and he has to survive, and the only thing he has with him is a small hatchet. And so stories about survival are pretty common in a man versus nature conflict. Man versus society. I think this is one of the more interesting types of conflicts, and you have probably seen this type of conflict in some movies that you watched, but it's a character or a group of characters that fight against the society in which they live. Dystopian novels like Hunger Games and other set in the future where the world is kind of messed up. I'm drawing a blank on what the name of that movie is. Divergence. There we go. Those types of stories where there's a society that usually the characters are trying to start a revolution against the society in which they live. The Giver, that's another good one that we can think of. And so the society becomes a character itself. Usually we see these types of stories where the author is trying to make a point to show something that's wrong in society. And we call that satire. Satire is something we will discuss later on in the school year, but I wanted to make you aware of this man versus society conflict, and I've given you an example here of a man versus society in a movie. This is from the movie Rudy. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It's about a young man that wants to play football at the University of Notre Dame. The only problem is he's too small and he's not smart enough to get into college. But despite those things, and despite everybody else telling him, you can't do this, you can't do this, and his dad, his brother, his high school coach, the coaches at Notre Dame, even the priest tell him, you can't do this, you're not going to be able to do it. And he does it. And so that is man versus society, where he is fighting through this. So if you view the other presentation that does not have me speaking, does not have the audio, you can watch the movie trailer, and watch the movie if you can, because it's a really good movie. We're not going to watch that. There we go. Man versus self. All right, so this is our internal conflict. Man versus self is where the character's struggle takes place in his or her own mind. So a lot of times this is about a character has a tough decision to make and they can't choose what they should do, or maybe the character is shy and they have to overcome some type of disability or something that's keeping them from being their best self. And so the cartoon I have here, this is about the common struggle of, should I do the right thing or should I do the wrong thing? And so man versus self is one of our common things. A lot of time there will be an internal conflict to go along with an external conflict.